But let me start by saying I'm truly honored to be here with you today, but most importantly to share about Rwanda's digital journey and our transformation process. I'm sure you've had a couple of other colleagues from government, private sector, civil society, development partners that have been here with you, since the start of this conference, and each one of them has shared a bit about what they're doing, and that really forms, the story that Rwanda is today. So mine will be a focus mostly on what our journey has been in terms of putting digital at the heart of everything that we do as a country, but also saying that we are talking about the new economic diplomacy. I think we can't forget to think about what tech diplomacy is going to look like, a concept that perhaps started with Denmark and in many countries are starting to adopt, because more than ever, there's a need for partnerships and collaboration when it comes to the global tech ecosystem. A bit about what our 22-year journey is, and you may ask why 22 years, because after the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, what really happened was that this was a sector or an industry that was close to non-existent, very, very nascent, as you can imagine. We only had one telecommunication company, which was MTN Rwanda. And so our starting point as a country was to say, A, we don't have natural resources, we're a landlocked country, but also, coming from ashes, we really need to develop very fast. And so we needed to figure out very quickly what were going to be those drivers for growth for us, and those that were going to set us at par with many countries that had been growing and developing with minimal or no disruption at all. So technology, ICT, name it, innovation, however you call it in your different jurisdictions, was really one of the key growth drivers that we identified. Now, starting from a very nascent industry, just one telecommunication company, we had to think through the basics, really. We had to think about liberalizing the telecommunication market if we're going to think about access and affordability for the Rwandan population. We had to think about building institutional frameworks. A ministry such as the Ministry of ICT and Innovation didn't exist back then. The regulatory authority that was very focused on ICT and tech didn't exist. Whether it's RISA, which is the implementation agency that really sort of, consolidates and follows up on implementation of how we adopt digital technologies in every sector, also didn't exist. So a number of institutional frameworks that needed to be in place to sort of chart the way forward and the vision and the policies and strategies that we were going to take on for at least 20 years. And so once that was done, we had to then go into another 5 years. So that took about 5 years, which was 2001 to 2005. Then 2006 to 2010, we focused on what is that foundational, aspect that has to be in place if we really want to be a digital economy. So remember, we were starting off from our vision is to transform the country from an agriculture-based economy to a knowledge-based economy. And so infrastructure was one critical foundational aspect that need to be put in place. And so whether it was the investments that we put in as government to build the national backbone infrastructure, to think about national cybersecurity infrastructure, because we're going to be digitizing a lot of government functions and services, and so we needed to safeguard both the infrastructure and information assets. And so all of these really, that 5-year period of 2006 to 2010 was primarily focused on putting in place that critical infrastructure that was going to seed the many results that we see today. Fast forward 2011, and so our 20-year plan was really broken down into 4 5-year rolling plans, and so that's why I'm giving you 5-year timelines. And so the third bit of those 5-year rolling plans was 2011 to 2015, which now was really focused on how do we leverage this infrastructure in a way that is meaningful for a Rwandan, that they understand. Because it's one thing to have fiber, running across your farm, but if you really don't understand what it means, are you connected? What does that really mean for you? And so being connected was one thing, but it was also understanding what are going to be those things that really can benefit from having that kind of infrastructure in place. And so we took a policy decision as a government to digitize all our services. So most of our government services are digitized. We have a target to ensure that at least all of them are digitized within the next 2 years. So we have a 7-year plan that ends in 2024. And so today, and I'm sure for most of you who have been here longer, you will know that we have this single platform as a country where for every government service that you need, you're able to access it online. And why is that important? Because we didn't want our citizens to be thinking about more than hundreds of websites where they must go for a particular service. If you're looking for a passport, you have to think, okay, what is the immigration website? If you're looking for a birth certificate, is it my districts? We have 30 districts. Which district is going to give me the birth certificate? So we had to consolidate all of that into a single platform. And that has also had its gains, and I'll come back to the innovation bit, which is really critical for us. But we also had to think about what does adoption look like in each of the sectors, whether it's education, whether it's agriculture, healthcare, financial services, all of those sectors, really thinking at a very basic level what it means to go digital, but in a way that creates value for our citizens. And Rwanda hasn't been left behind when you compare to the rate of mobile adoption, especially when it comes to payments and digital payments. And so these have been those things that really can speak to the needs of a citizen and how they can access services, but also how they can be included, because inclusion is a key. And I like that you talk about adaptability, but for us at the heart of every policy that we have and strategies is inclusion. Inclusion of the marginalized communities, inclusion of people living with disabilities, inclusion women, young people, all of that. And so every policy that we have in place is always catering for all those buckets of our population. So where we are at today, which is really the final phases of that 20-year policy that we have laid out, is really around innovation. And I want to dwell a little bit on this because I know the panel that spoke earlier, most of the panelists that were speaking earlier did touch on innovation ecosystems. I liked some of the interventions. We all like Silicon Valley. I wish we could all, go to bed and wake up and we have a Silicon Valley in our different jurisdictions. But I think what we need to understand is that what happened in Silicon Valley was inorganic growth. And so if you want to replicate it, most likely it's not going to work. But what is really important to understand is what are the critical ingredients for having an innovation ecosystem? Because what will work in one place may not necessarily work in another, but it's really figuring out what is an innovation ecosystem? How do you define it, not to a particular jurisdiction, but to the outcomes and outputs that come out of that innovation ecosystem? And Rwanda, just like many countries, we fell for the trap of trying to recreate a Silicon Valley. And you can imagine everyone that tries to recreate a Silicon Valley starts with hard infrastructure, buildings. And I might say with the experience that I've had in really thinking about innovation ecosystems, that perhaps that is the easiest, but also the least needed ingredient in building an innovation ecosystem. The very first ingredient that everyone must be thinking about wherever they are is talent. If you have the right people, then you will build an innovation ecosystem. So for us, it started by thinking about infrastructure, and it was hard infrastructure, it was putting land aside, and then we realized, look here, this is, like, we may have magnificent looking buildings, but these buildings are not going to create products or solutions. So we had to think about the people. Whether it's the universities that are creating and churning out the graduates that you need that are going to go into the ecosystem. But we also quickly realized that actually, if we try to go through the traditional education system to produce the talent that we need, then most likely we have 20 years ahead before we get there. And so we've really, experimented with different models. We've experimented with having what is the equivalent of the second half of secondary school, creating what we've called the Coding Academy, where we get 15 to 17-year-olds that are really excelling in mathematics, and then we take them through a strict structured curriculum on coding, embedded software development. And most of these kids, when they're getting out of the school, they have the skills, they actually have skills that are employable within the workforce. Now, do we have enough? Absolutely not. And I think it brings me back to the question of scale, because when you're talking about innovation, scalability is very important. And you may ask, what does scale really mean? Now, if you look, just to take an example of Africa, if you do a very quick scan, you will not find less than 13 countries that all have an ambition of becoming an innovation hub. And it's not a bad thing. I actually think it's a blessing. It's a good thing that we have that many countries. I wish all 54 had that ambition. Because when you take a country like the US, when you look at the number of innovation hotspots they have in their country, it tells a story. It means even for Africa, we should be able to have hundreds of such innovation hotspots, but then figure out a way where we collaborate and provide scale to the solutions that are coming out of each of the innovation ecosystems. But even as you come with the grand vision of having an innovation ecosystem, it's always important to understand what's your competitive advantage. What is it that you're going to do differently, or what advantage do you have over the other ecosystems? Now, for Rwanda, it was such a tough reflection because for us, like I said earlier, we're a landlocked country, but also we're a country of 13 million now. If you're looking for global companies, when they're looking for a new place to go to, if they're looking for new markets in Africa, perhaps Rwanda doesn't even come among the first 10, because from a market size perspective, it just really doesn't cut it. And so we say, but we know many countries that have been able to be at the forefront of innovation, at the forefront of technology. Countries like Israel, countries like Estonia, countries like Singapore, and they have also small populations, some of them even smaller than ours. What is it that they've done differently? And 50 years ago, when they were starting where we are today, what is it that they did differently to sort of position themselves 50 years later to be ahead of the curve when it comes to building innovations? And so that kind of reflection is what helped us to craft what we've called, what is really our strategy in becoming an innovation hub, which is to be a proof of concept hub. And you may ask, what does proof of concept mean? Because at the end of the day, and I liked what you said earlier around context, it's the kind of challenges we are solving for in one part of the world may not necessarily be the same across different parts of the world. And so the idea for us is, how do we think about the challenges that may not necessarily be unique for Rwanda? If you're solving for access to healthcare challenge, it's not unique to Rwanda. When you go to Ghana, when you go to Senegal, when you go to Cote d'Ivoire, they have a similar challenge. So if you find something that works in Rwanda, then most likely it's going to be something that you can scale and replicate to other parts of the continent that have a similar challenge. And so that's where we had, we decided to really structure our vision and strategy around being a proof of concept, where we can bring all the Pan-African talent here, they co-create solutions together, but they create solutions for a market that is bigger than Rwanda, because that's the only way they're going to be able to survive, to scale, to become unicorns. Everyone in the tech sector will understand that being a unicorn is such a big thing. And most startups, when they're starting, that's what's happening. But also what's so important, and I know we have a couple of startups in our midst, is not everyone that has a good idea has to build a business. You could build a product that can be bought by someone else and move on to the next challenge. And I think trying to figure out, am I good for building a company or building products and pivoting and moving on to something else, I think is always something that every startup, small and medium business must be thinking of as they start to grow. The second ingredient for, and I did mention talent, the second one is really around policies. And I know you earlier challenged everyone, you're like, why are you looking for policies and regulations? It's right. And there's always this chicken and egg situation. Do policies and regulations come first, or innovations? But what we've seen in most of the developing world is that they never go together actually. Innovation, the rate of innovation far outpaces the rate at which we can build policies and regulations. And at some point as policymakers, we must be comfortable with knowing that we can't regulate what we don't know. And so sometimes being able, the same risk-taking culture that businesses will have as they build products and everything is what we probably have to put in place as we really create an environment that nurtures those kind of innovations that are most likely going to be birthed at a time where you don't have any regulation or policy in place. And we have a perfect example for that, which was Zipline, because when they came, they had a good technology, which was using drones for logistics. What Rwanda had was a problem of how do we deliver medical products to healthcare, to 500 healthcare facilities across the country. So what we did was to say, fine, there are no regulations globally or anywhere. Let's figure out what the risks are, and let's create regulations as you pilot the solution. In piloting it, we'll learn, we'll know what works and what doesn't work, and we'll also change the regulations and policies. And that is really what has even given birth to more than 10 drone companies that we have within the ecosystem. But had we chosen to sit and wait and see for someone else to build regulations, we would be far from what we've already seen within the industry that we have here. And today's Zipline that started in Rwanda, serving only 500 hospitals, is serving over 10,000 in about 4 markets, and they continue to grow and expand. And so I think as we think about innovation, it's really what's that openness from a policy and regulatory angle that allows us to be open enough to these innovations, very well aware that there are risks, unknown risks more so, because we cannot go into details of understanding all risks, otherwise we'll never be able to pivot and pilot and even test some of these solutions, but really figuring out what's the bare minimum that has to be put in place. The third one, again, which is critical for entrepreneurs and startups, is really financing. And from financing, we think about banks and everything, but when it comes to tech and innovation, and particularly for Africa, where a majority of the people that are leading, the development of some of these products and solutions are mostly in the youth bracket, where their access to finance can be limited by, they don't have much that they can put out there. They will not go to a bank that is asking for collateral because what they have is just a very good idea. And so thinking about VC, angel, funders, and everyone who can really bet on them and give them financing all the way from seed to growth capital is really important. And here again, I think the challenge is understanding who plays where. I think what we're also learning through our experimentation as a government is that there are areas we can play best, which is really around pre-seed and seed financing and grants, because that's not something someone like a VC is going to be able to provide. But being able to build that pipeline, I think, is really the responsibility that as governments we would put in place. Now, I want to end off with about 3 things that I would want us to reflect on. I think as we think about scale, as we think about innovation, where we are going even for us as a country, I did mention that inclusion is important, but there are also aspects that are very important, not just from a policy-making lens, but even from an entrepreneurial lens, which is accessibility and affordability. Because the more people that can't afford your product or your service, then the less of a market that you can have, but also the less of an impact that we can perhaps provide. And I think we have a green space when we talk about collaboration and partnership, really, which is at the heart of many of the conversations that have been happening here, to understand how do we make it easy for entrepreneurs to create solutions, but also make it affordable and accessible for those that so desire to have access to some of those services. Because the absence of such a conversation or a partnership that is geared towards inclusion, accessibility, and affordability means we continue to leave so many people behind. And I think as we think about being digital economies, as we think about partnerships across borders, these 3 things have to be taken into consideration. So I know you've had a lot this afternoon around that, but I just wanted to share with you a few reflections on what we are doing as a country as we position ourselves to be a proof of concept hub. We are finalizing our Startup Act, which really looks at what are those unique incentives that startups that are going to help startups to scale. We know most of them will go through the valley of death, and so if they don't have the necessary support, then it's difficult to have a target such as churning out 5,000 startups a year if you're not really thinking about those incentives that are so critical for their growth. One other thing that we're doing beyond the data protection and privacy law that we have is also, as government, especially in most of the African countries, government is the biggest client or buyer of these technology solutions. But the thing that we keep hearing from most startups is that it's not a level playing field, because when I go out to look for a solution as a government institution, I'm looking for tested and tried solutions. What a startup has is an innovative solution that hasn't been tested and tried anywhere. So they're also looking for someone to bet on them. So if we can't bet on our own startups, then the question of scale that everyone has been talking about is not going to happen. So what we've created is what we call the Public Procurement for Innovation policy that allows us to carve out part of our budget and also procurement processes not to look for tested and tried solutions, but rather to look for solutions, to really scan a wide range of solutions that would be a good fit for the problem that we are trying to solve for. So when we go out, we're not tendering or prescribing what solution we're looking for. We just tender a problem. We look at the number of solutions, the spectrum of solutions that we can find. Of course, then the financing of that is quite different from a normal public procurement, but I think it's the only way we can bet on our young people and innovators that are building solutions and are looking for someone to trust them and give them a place to start before they can even think about scaling. So I thank you very much.